Still on. That I don't know. Interesting. A little bit. There's that. Is that better? I don't know what it's doing. As I said, this goes into the header of not today's problem, but it's quickly becoming such. We'll leave it on and see what happens. Work or it won't, I guess. Yeah, so a little bit of weather issues this week, and then you have across the country, different people struggling with different things. Wildfires out west, which is always interesting as you think of wildfires, and we're in the same country, but so far away that we don't think about it till the smoke makes its way over here. And I was watching something the other day talking about how Americans don't travel as much as Europeans do. And somebody says, well, yes, they do. They just don't leave their country because their country is larger than Europe. And sometimes that affects the way we think and relate and our perspective on things as well. It's so big, we don't think about what others are dealing with or what they're going through. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Rule number 3 of our Mediterranean Sea rules, the headline to that, the subhead, the same God who governs the weather can guide you through the storms. Not literal storms like we had this week with the hurricane that came through, but with the storms of life, which are very much just as significant. And as I'm talking about perspective and what we they affect us. Those storms can be bigger and more life-altering than a hurricane that goes through. And the same God who governs the weather can guide us. The rule for this week, rule number 3, speak your mind without losing your leverage. We'll come back and see that a couple of times, but in the conclusion, we'll come back and talk about that for a quick moment. And I think I did not change the reference here for some reason. And so go to verse 9. Now when much time was spent, you know what, let me do one thing here. I've got my notes, and I think I changed the notes on mine, or the reference on mine. And I may have changed it on yours. I'm looking at the slide here, which I did not change on. Verse 9, and we'll look at these couple of verses here. Now when much time was spent and sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now past. Now let's pause there. We looked in the first couple of lessons, a little bit in lesson 1, a little bit in lesson 2. Look over to, look at verse 4. When we had launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus because the winds were contrary. Look at verse 7. When we had sailed slowly many days and scarce were come over against Cydnus, the wind not suffering us. They're dealing with weather issues. And the reason is they're not sailing when they're supposed to be. We mentioned this last week, that off-season is a great time to get vacation deals, but not a good time to sail on the Mediterranean. And that's what they're dealing with here. Much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous. Notice the word that Luke uses here. Because the fast was now past, Paul admonished them and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and with much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives. That's kind of a bleak prediction coming here. We are going to encounter great danger with much damage. Not just to the ship and the goods, but to the people. Verse 11, nevertheless the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship, more than those things which were spoken by Paul. And because the haven was not commodious to winter in, okay, so they're traveling, it's not just in the fall, it's late in the fall. If they're looking to winter already. Because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they might attain to Phenis, and there to winter, which is a haven of Crete, and lieth toward the southwest and northwest. So he kind of gives us here what they're dealing with. Paul speaks up. He says, hey, I want to let you know this is not going to end well. And the centurion, not the centurion ship, but because he's there, he's the final voice. The centurion is the representative of the Roman government, so he kind of wins any argument. And it tells us that, verse 11, nevertheless the centurion believed the master more than those things. It tells us who's making the final decision. We have our map kind of showing where we're going here, and they're in this area up here, okay, around Crete. Cydnus over here, that's where we were last week. They're sailing across here, and they're coming here around Crete. Our first note here, this is just a me thing. I don't have a great affinity for know-it-alls. And most people don't, but there sure are a lot of them out there. They know everything about everything. They may not know what the question is, but they know what the answer is. And they're not afraid to share it. I've got a few verses. We're not going to take time to turn to them, but I've got a few verses written into the notes, a couple of references that we'll look at later. But first from James, even so the tongue. This lesson, if you just look at that title, Speak Your Mind Without Losing Your... This lesson's all about the mouth, the tongue. Even so the tongue is a little member, and boasteth great things. And this next statement, behold how great a matter a little fire kindleth. We mentioned here a moment ago, we've been dealing with rains and flood. Out west they're dealing with wildfires. These wildfires usually start with a small spark. It may be a small campfire that somebody doesn't tend to and it gets away from them. It may be a lightning strike, which is big, but in comparison to the end result of the whole fire, it's not. Sometimes it's literally a small spark. That one spark, that one flame can create a massive problem. And so can the tongue. Just because I have an opinion doesn't mean it's worth a whole lot. Doesn't mean it's worth much. Everybody has an opinion. Look at the next note. Just because I have an opinion doesn't mean everyone else needs to hear it. Everyone has an opinion. Not everybody's opinion needs to be heard. The guy who doesn't know what I'm doing or what I'm going through and doesn't understand what God has said about who I am, what I'm going through, I don't really care what he has to say. And at this point, if we wanted to go into society in general, there are lots of interesting statements that we could make about people who don't know what they're talking about but are very loud and boisterous. In politics today, this is not just U.S. politics, but it's definitely true here, in politics around the world today, the best argument is usually by the one who's the loudest. At least that's what it seems like, right? He's loud, he must know what he's talking about. No, he might be just loud and have a big mouth. I mean, that's kind of where we are. And just because I have an opinion doesn't mean it's worth a whole lot. And just because I have an opinion doesn't mean you need to hear it. I need to make sure that my opinions line up with what God has said. If my opinion lines up with God's opinion, then you need to pay attention and listen up. That's important. Still in James, go a little bit earlier in the book in this case, wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. I'm talking with Josie, teaching things about, she's going into middle school this year, and this is not a comforting thought to mom and dad. I said, you want to know how I used this verse when I was counseling kids in school? I'd say, what this says here is, open your ears, shut your mouth, open your heart. Listen, don't talk, learn what you're being told. Take heed to it. Let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak. Every man has an opinion. And what do they want to do? They want to make sure that everybody knows their opinion. Well, then you miss, as you're talking, at the same time they're talking, you're not hearing what they're saying. You may choose to speak, but others may choose not to listen. And all of that introduction, look back to the title for this lesson here. Speak your mind without losing your leverage. Understand, you may talk, and you may be right, and they may not pay a bit of attention to what you have to say. We've read the passage already. Does that sound like what Paul was dealing with? He had a worthwhile opinion. But that doesn't mean that we're listening to him. Well, let's run through the notes then. Soft skills. This dealing with like sales and stuff like that. Okay. I have a quote here first from theologian from days past, Arthur Pink. Maybe you've seen Pink's commentaries and things like that. If we only realize that everything which enters our life is ordered by God and we acted in accord with this, then should we maintain our composure. Oh, hey, there's an interesting thought. Then should we maintain our composure and conduct ourselves with unruffled serenity. When we understand that everything that we deal with is ordered by the Almighty, it should affect the way I deal with the things I'm dealing with. Does it? When I understand that 5+ inches of rain that caused me to lose water for a day or so, who's in charge of the weather? It's not Tom Russell or whoever else is on the news telling us what the weather's going to do, right? If God's in charge of the weather and the weather comes and negatively impacts, I had plans for this week. If the weather negatively impacts what I'm doing, I need to understand that it's God, and I need to deal with it with, to use the term that Pink used, serenity. Calm down. Remember, God's in control. And that has not changed. Has not changed since creation. At no point has God lost control of the situation. Next we have from Proverbs chapter 12. There is that speaketh like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise is health. Calm down, speak the truth. Say right words. Say what needs to be heard, but let her be there. Say the right words with the right spirit. That's important. It's not just that I'm saying what you need to hear. It's that I'm saying what you need to hear in a way that you're going to be willing to listen to me. If I get up in your face and you know the first thing that's going to happen? You're going to take a step back. Second thing that's going to happen? You're going to turn your ears off. Right? I need to be willing to speak the truth, but to speak the truth with the right spirit, the right attitude. And Paul here, Paul says, sirs, I perceive that this voyage is not going to go well. I mean, look at, it's not, hey, bud, turn around. Now, what's he saying? Hey, bud, turn around. But that's not how he's saying it, is it? It's important that we understand communication is more than just talking. Communication is bidirectional. I speak, you listen, you speak, I listen. If I'm talking and nobody's listening, I might as well turn around and talk to the wall, right? That accomplishes the same thing. Paul understood the perils of sailing. We looked at this, I think it was last week, when we gave his quick biographical sketch as he was writing to the Corinthians. And he said, hey, I have been through it. And amongst the things that he has gone through, he says, I've been shipwrecked 3 times. And that was before this passage was written. He understood sailing does not always go the way you planned. And he understood, I mean, Luke has told us a couple of times in different words, but a couple of times in this passage, that this is not the time of the year to be out on the Mediterranean. This is not the time to be sailing from here to there. Paul understood this. Luke understood this. What did Paul do? Paul spoke his concerns to the guy in authority. Sirs, I perceive. Who's he talking to? Centurion, the master, the owner of the ship. Now, is this the master who is the owner of the ship, or is this the master and the owner of the ship? We don't know if he's talking to 2 or 3. It doesn't really tell us here. Kind of seems like it's 3, but don't know for sure. But there's at least 2. And he speaks his concerns to the people in authority, those who are making the decisions. But he had no control over how they received that information, did he? They chose not to heed his warnings. Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and the ship, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. We cannot control others' responses. We cannot control whether or not they listen, and if they do listen, what they do with the information that we give them. And we have that shown to us incredibly clearly in the Gospels. Jesus Christ has 12 apostles. These 12 apostles spend 3.5 years with him. One of them, who spent day in, day out, did not take heed to the truth of the message. If he could walk with Jesus and turn his back and betray him, then why should I be shocked when somebody doesn't listen to me? Right? We can't control another's responses. And we see in the passage here this sound advice plus deaf ears equals hardship. Now, the hardship shows up in the next lesson. But just look at the very opening statement in verse 13. And when the south wind blew softly, that kind of implies that things are going to go smoothly, right? Look at the opening of verse 14. But not long after but not long after kind of implies that there is a meanwhile back at the ranch scene coming here. And that's what they're going to face. The centurion listens to the master, the owner of the ship, says, okay, let's keep going. We're good. And the south winds blow softly. And they're all like, all right, we got a good voyage. We got some good tailwind. Let's go. And then things turn. Sound advice plus deaf ears equals hardship. It may not happen at that exact moment. It may be today, it may be tomorrow, it may be the next day. But when I don't listen to godly counsel, I can rest assured I'm going to wish I had. I'm going to look back and say, if only I had, and you can fill in the blank at that point. Now, this is interesting. When those in authority disregarded Paul's warnings, he maintained a right attitude. Now, again, we're looking at this week's, kind of looking at some foreshadowing at next week. But even as if we would dive into next week's and look at the storm, we never find Paul saying those famous words, I told you so. I mean, you knew exactly what I was going to say before I said it, didn't you? I mean, chances are pretty good that you and I have made that statement at one time or more. Right? I told you. You should have listened to me. We don't find Paul doing that. He maintained a right attitude throughout. Remember our header here. Speak your mind without losing. If he starts showing, you should have, they're going to chunk him overboard. Okay. In the midst of this, what do they not want to deal with? Diplomacy and tact are important traits. They get way too often thrown into the discussion of politics. And if we like the guy or don't like the guy, we determine whether or not we like diplomacy and tact. But diplomacy and tact are important traits. Think of work. When there's a problem at work, when you blow up and lose your cool, how much do you actually get done? Or if you can work through something logically and rationally, how much do you get done? When the term that is not original with me, it's used with lots of people, but when things go sideways, you can throw up your hands and give up, or you can say, all right, let's find a solution here. Diplomacy and tact. Paul counseled but didn't complain. I mean, opening statement. I don't know about you, but I don't have any kind of an affinity for know-it-alls. I also not a big fan of people that complain about each and everything. He spoke the truth. He trusted God. I mean, he tells them, sirs, I perceive that this voyage is going to go poorly. When they didn't listen, hey, Luke, could you find me another seatbelt? I mean, how does he act and react here? Through it all, he has to trust the Almighty. Verse from the Psalms. Set a watch, O Lord, before my mouth. Keep the door of my lips. God, guard my tongue, is what the psalmist is saying. Well, what sort of filter is on the mouth? You know, there's ratings on movies and TV shows. It'll pop up and it'll tell you that this is for mature audiences, this is for general audience, this is rated whatever. You can have a filter on your internet at home where it does its best to try to keep certain things out. What sort of filter is on the tongue? There are way too many people that speak what they think, even though their thinker doesn't work real well. Think, then speak. And in some cases, it's think, rethink, think one more time, then speak. But think about what you're saying. Think about what you're going to say. Think about how it's going to be received. Think about what the impact is. Think before you speak. Then, the next point here, what do we do when the majority is wrong? Now, this, again, keep in mind, I was a teacher for a lot of years, and I taught English for a while, but primarily I taught history, government, and economics. So this whole time of the year is interesting to me, even though I refuse to sit and watch it because it just aggravates the fire out of me. I'm tired of people who get up and tell us everything we want to hear and then don't do a thing about it anyhow. So, that said, we hear a lot of talk about democracy right now, which is nothing more than majority rule. And I've seen some good clips that say, we don't have, talk about this is not what we have and this is why we don't have, this is what we have and this is, so I've seen some good information about that. But that's not out, the people don't want to listen to that. When the majority is wrong and they're the ones that are in charge, it means you're probably going to be going in the wrong direction. Next verse that we have here from Proverbs 21. Whoso keepeth his mouth and his tongue keepeth his soul from troubles. The majority is wrong. Still got to guard my tongue. Which is the very next statement that we have. Guard your tongue. We just had this. Think before you speak. Avoid trouble. Demonstrate self-control. That doesn't mean that you're going to be completely without trouble. Just do your best to avoid it. There's sometimes you can't avoid it. There's nothing you can do. But do your best. Don't throw gasoline on the fire. Now, when we read this passage here, and we see the centurion, Paul says, but sirs, I perceive that this voyage is going to be wrought with damage to the ship, to the stuff on the ship, to the people on the ship. It's going to not go well. Nevertheless, the centurion listened. Put yourself in the centurion's place. Are you going to listen to the guy that's going to trial in Rome, or are you going to listen to the guy that his whole job is to live on the sea and run the boat? From the centurion's perspective, he did the right thing. He listened to the one who made his living on the sea. It's easy for us to sit back and throw darts at the centurion and say, boy, you should have known better than that. When we do the same thing, we listen to our friends and neighbors and the people who are living a life similar to us and don't listen to the Word of God when it's presented to us. We do the same thing. The centurion listened to the one who, by all accounts, was the one he should have listened to. Well, by all accounts, save one, God's account. His response, he should have listened to the one that was close to God, the one to whom God spoke. When Paul says, but sirs, why was he saying this? Because God had impressed upon him that this was going to be problematic. That's who the centurion should have listened to. But he did what everybody else does. He listened to the one who, I think they know best. And his response made perfect sense. But sometimes what makes sense doesn't make sense. Sometimes what makes sense does not, because he did what he should have, except that God was directly involved in this situation. God gave him information. Now, the decision makers, whether it was a centurion and an owner-operator, or whether it was a centurion and an owner and an operator, the 2 or 3 people here making the decisions were in agreement. That's what verse 11 tells us. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and owner of the ship more than those things. So if he believed him, then he agreed with them. A couple things here. First of all, truth is not found through polls and surveys. Again, we're not going through political. This is just life in general. I don't care if it's a consumer survey, and they're calling, asking what you think of the economy, or what you think of your standard of living, or anything like that. I don't care what the survey is about. Truth isn't found in polls and surveys. Truth is found in the pages of the Word of God. And when the Word of God and the poll and the survey don't line up, I need to know what direction to turn. We need to listen to counselors. The writer of Proverbs talks about in the multitude of counselors. But we need to listen to godly counselors. If I'm listening to counselors in general who are not redeemed, then you know what I'm doing? I'm listening to lots of voices, but nobody's speaking what I need to hear. I need to listen to counselors, but godly counselors. That multitude of counselors, if they're without God, they have nothing to add. You'll see, if there's a poll or a survey done, typically they'll preface it. There was a poll taken of 1,000 people, yada, yada, yada. If those 1,000 people don't really understand the situation and all they've done is cast a vote, speak an opinion, give their point of view, but they really haven't added anything to the situation. There's the other side of that is, I can have all these counselors and advisors, they may be godly. If I don't do anything with the information I've given, I've done nothing to help the situation. Paul gave information. The centurion chose not to accept it. The decision makers are all in agreement. We're going to sail on. We can make it. I got one more verse here from Proverbs again. He that hath understanding spareth his words. He that hath understanding doesn't feel the need to just keep talking. And a man of understanding is of an excellent spirit, which is interesting because the second half of our title is Don't Lose Your Leverage. He that hath knowledge spareth his words. Speak your point, be done. What does Paul do? Basically, now again, Luke didn't necessarily write the entire statement, but what Luke's written, this was a short, succinct statement. One sentence, maybe a couple. And that was it. He didn't feel the need to wax eloquent for hours and hours. And we know from other passages, Paul could do that. Not the time. Then the next, allow God to show who was right. All the decision makers are in agreement. Democracy, man. The majority rules. And God says, watch this. Now, we'll see this played out for us next week. But before long, everybody on board knew. Knew what? Maybe we should have listened to that man over there in the corner. Everybody knew that Paul was right. And it's important to be right even when others think you're wrong. We talk about the storms of life. We talk about the storms on the Mediterranean. Don't be somebody whose opinion on a matter is tossed about by the waves of public opinion. Be right even when others think you're wrong. And there will come time when people, they may say, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to watch. No, that's not what it is. Just maintain your composure, keep a right attitude, but make sure you are right. It's not about you. God is the judge of who is right. God is the judge of what is right. He's in control. He's the judge. Well, the conclusion. Again, speak your mind without losing your leverage. I almost renamed that, and that's the first thing you have in the conclusion there. I was going to rename it to speak your mind without losing yours. Because isn't that usually what happens? I speak my mind, they don't listen, and I get mad, throw my little 2-year-old temper tantrum, or 22-year-old temper tantrum, or pick your age, right? Isn't that what we usually do? I've mentioned complainers, know-it-alls. This is another person that was nails on the old-fashioned chalkboard for me. Don't be the person that feels the need to inject themselves into each and every conversation. Remember we talked about swift to hear, slow to speak? We've got 2 ears, 1 mouth. If we would use this one half as much as we use these, we'd be a lot better off. Don't be the person that every time somebody's talking, you have to add your 2 cents worth. This is important. This is like vitally important. When we speak the truth from God, it is He that they heed or ignore. Don't take it personally. If Paul had taken it personally when they ignored him, then they come back to him later and he says, nope, you didn't listen to me last time, I'm not going to tell you this time. I mean, think about that for a second. But that's the way so many people live. I'm going to show you, right? Bridges are made to be traveled on, not burned. And as peoples, we are really good at burning bridges behind us, aren't we? And when that happens, I lose the opportunity to go back and minister to that person or those people. Don't lose your leverage. Don't lose your position. Don't lose the ability to minister. Never forget that we represent the Almighty. If I have accepted Jesus Christ as my Savior, I represent God Himself on this earth. And I need to make sure that my words, my behavior, my demeanor reflects that. If you're an ambassador for a country across the sea, the quickest way for you to get recalled home is to cast a poor light on your home country. They'll jerk your chain so fast. Why? Because you represent them. I need to be willing to set aside my own thoughts and ideas and focus on God's words. Again, we started out in the introduction. Everybody has an opinion. And everybody does. And I need to be willing to set aside my opinion and get my opinion now to line up with God's opinion. Not all proclaimers. Notice I didn't say preachers, because it's easy for us to compartmentalize and say, that's talking about Pastor Wes. No, not all proclaimers of God's words need to be fire breathers. Paul's talking here. Sirs, I perceive that this voyage, he's diplomacy and tact. He's giving them information. There are lots of ways, and you can picture it in your mind. Lots of ways that conversation could have gone. Lots of ways the next conversation could have gone. But he practices diplomacy and tact. You got Teddy Roosevelt here. Some of us focus on the big stick, don't we? Right? Speak softly, but be ready to back it up if you need to. Some of us think we need to every time somebody opens their mouth. Majority rule sounds good, but understand that majority rule is still the rule of sinful man. Depraved man. It sounds good until I put that sinful man part into it, and then it doesn't sound so hot at all. Side with the Almighty because he's never been wrong. God's always been right. Let's look at two passages, one New Testament, one Old Testament. We're in Acts. Let's go over to 1 Corinthians. Early in the book, chapter 1, 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 25. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. God's thoughts, God's opinions are far above the best and the brightest that we have to offer. The most intelligent man that's ever lived was a numbskull when you put his thoughts and ideas compared to the thoughts and ideas of the Almighty. And then Isaiah 55. Isaiah 55, look at 2 verses here, and we'll be done today. Isaiah 55. Similar statement, Old Testament this time. Isaiah writes, he says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God's trying to make it clear. Hey, I know what I'm talking about. Listen to me. The children of Israel did not do a good job with that. And you know what? The children of central Pennsylvania don't do a good job with that. God says, I know what I'm talking about. Listen to me. And I go through life encountering these little storms and trials that I deal with, and I want to listen to me rather than him. If I find myself in a situation where I have opportunity to give counsel to a friend or neighbor with the troubles and trials that they're going through, I need to speak the truth in love and maintain a right spirit so that when they don't listen, the next time, who are they going to come to? If I blow up and lose my temper, guess where they're not going next time? I want to be. I heard this talking about a similar statement. We'll wrap up with this about sales. Somebody said, and Wes talked about it even when he was giving his Sherwin-Williams illustration just this last week. He said, I think his words were, I want to be the next call. If I lose my testimony, guess who they're not calling next? Speak the truth, maintain your leverage. Father, thank you for your goodness and graciousness. Thank you for the many illustrations that you give us in the Word of how we are to live in a world that is adversarial to you. And Father, help us to always remember that we represent you. It is not us. And Father, help us to take advantage of the opportunities that we have to give sound, biblical, godly counsel. But Father, help us also be people who listen to such counsel, who take heed to it, who put it to practice. Father, help us to look for opportunities to minister. Help us to receive those who seek to minister to us. Father, I ask you to be with the service to come, be with Pastor Wood. You give him the words to say. Help the message that we hear to speak to our hearts. Father, help it to have an inroad and to change us, so that we might be conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. We ask in your name, amen.